Leonard Harris is a professor of philosophy at Purdue University. He's the editor of Racism, The Critical Pragmatism of Alain Locke, The Philosophy of Alain Locke, Harlem Renaissance and Beyond, and of course, Philosophy Born of Struggle, Anthology of Afro-American Philosophy from 1917. He heads the Alain Locke Society and of course the Philosophy Born of Struggle Association.
Thank you very much. It's also impossible to go after that Sanchez. It's not possible at all. You just simply have a sense of appreciation and space and openness and a newness of your life. I'd like to thank Rutgers University, the New Jersey Council for Humanities. I'd like to especially thank Clem Price, who back in 1977, Clem and I were living in New Jersey, New Jersey. We founded an association called ESOP. And at that time, ESOP was a group of families of about 7 of us. And we'd gather together each month and talk about the nature of life, the nature of philosophy, the nature of love, and what we needed to do to be a community. And ESOP eventually, in the next year, wrote a proposal to the New Jersey Commission for the Humanities. It was the first proposal funded by blacks from New Jersey Council of Humanities. When I walked into Clem's office last year with Anna Severfield, he reminded me of what we had done back in those days. I said, Clem, you know, we're still walking in the water, brother. We're still working in the way. And the next week, we had a regathering of ESOP of 30 families back in New Jersey, back in southern New Jersey. All of them had maintained contact. We talked about our children. They've been meeting ever since, once a year at the very least, since 1977. So I want to thank Clem and in New Jersey, and Rutgers University especially, for the contribution you've made to our lives. I want to thank Anna and the Department of Philosophy as well. The history of philosophy in many ways is long dated. We were once in Illinois and had a Black Philosophy Conference in 1971. We were at Tuskegee Institute in Tuskegee, Alabama, between 1973 and 1976. We were at Wingspread Conference in Michigan in 1976. We were at Morgan State University in Baltimore, Maryland in 1979 for a Black Philosophy Conference. And many of those students from Morgan are now here. We were at the University District of Columbia in 1980 for a Black Philosophy Conference. We were at Haverford College in Haverford, Pennsylvania in 1982 for a Black Philosophy Conference. And all these conferences, each case we had a conference and then we had to have a conference somewhere else. There was no continual institution to maintain that conference. People like Cornel West, Lucius Outlaw, Frank Kirkland, William R. Jones came to those conferences. We had conferences and we talked about what it is to do philosophy within the context of America. And in that regard, we became friends. We never agreed on anything. Ever. There was no agreement. Out of that came things like the Black Committee on Philosophy for the American Philosophical Association, the Africana Studies Philosophy Association in New York. We have people, all sorts of persons who began to produce philosophy. We began to have books on philosophy. I published a work on Alain Leroy Locke, the most noted black pragmatist prior to Cornel West. Alain Leroy Locke graduated from Harvard in 1907. He graduated from Harvard University with a doctorate degree in September 17. Took his dissertation exam on September 17, 1917, before Ralph Barton Perry on the problems of classification and theory of value. How is it that you can classify people according to race? He graduated in 1918, did the New Negro in 1925. It didn't include everybody. It didn't include a member of the UNIA. It didn't include a great deal of what was occurring in terms of the oppression of black people in Harlem itself. But it did include so many people. It included whites, it included Jews, it included gays and lesbians at a time when no one was publishing material. It produced a presentation in the first page of what it is to be beautiful. And that picture was of a dark-skinned black woman holding a child. He received letters of condemnation for presenting what it is to be beautiful. The concept of beauty is represented by this person. Why can't she count as a moment of the aesthetic? It is out of that tradition that we eventually get people like Cornel West. Locke proposed a theory called critical pragmatism. He was affiliated and associated and influenced by the Baha'i faith. The next most important philosophical moment within American pragmatism would become prophetic pragmatism. We have books about Alain Locke. We have Judith Green's book on Alain Locke. We have other people's book on Alain Locke. We have Hibling's book on the one and the many about Locke. But the next important moment in the intellectual tradition of African American philosophy is Cornel West. We also have a number of other important moments within the context of African American philosophy. We have Dr. Karinga's work in terms of the ethics of how it is you're going to create a culture. But in 1983, when I published Philosophy Born Struggle, Dr. Karinga was in that book. Cornel West was in that book. Angela Davis was in that book. These were not household names at that time. Now they are household names. But at that time, these were nascent names, struggling on the underground, struggling underneath, going to conferences that nobody was paying them to go to. You know what I'm talking about? We used to talk about Cornel and his shoes. You know, I'm talking about the shoes, you know, but I'm saying people have come through the struggle and had to talk underneath the trees about what to do next. What to do next about the theories for which you engage. You don't always have to agree with one another, but you have to respect the standpoint out of which they come and engage them seriously in intellectual dialogue and debate. And appreciate the role upon which they travel. So in that sense, it's my great honor to introduce to you Dr. Cornel West, the author of Invasion of American Philosophy.
Lord, what a blessing to be here at Rutgers University in Newark, New Jersey. Just to set eyes on my dear friend and Brother Leonard Harris, Dr. Professor, Brother Comrade Leonard Harris. We go back 30 years, though, brother. Those precious memories of Tuskegee Institute and University District of Columbia. I love this brother deeply. I respect him. I admire him. He's been a laborer in the vineyard and connected with Brother J. Everett Green. Let's have Brother J. Everett Green stand up one more time. Both of y'all stand up. Both of y'all agree with that. This is very important because you see, these are the real heroes. These two are the real heroes. But oftentimes they're not in the limelight, but they're doing such important work. And they're trying to keep alive a particular tradition. When I look in the eyes of a brother who I first had dialogue with over 32 years ago, he was then a professor at Yale University. You remember the moment in New Orleans? I was then 23 years old. And this brother took me so seriously. He affirmed me. He gave me a sense of possibility. That's what we need to do for young folk today. And I'm talking about the one and only, the legendary Professor William Jones. Please stand up, brother. Please stand up. Yes, indeed, indeed. Yale University, Florida State University's work is known all around the world. And he raised a fundamental question that has yet to be answered, coming out of a tradition of African folk who had appropriated Christian narratives in order to understand themselves. He says, when I look at the situation, ought we not to wrestle with the query, is God a white racist? That's the problem of evil. The unjustified suffering, the unmerited pain, the unwarranted grief among these particular people being disproportionately distributed in the modern world. What kind of world is it? And if you have the audacity to believe in God, do you have a God worthy of worship in light of those conditions? That was the question that he raised. And he raised it lovingly. Makes a difference. So oftentimes philosophical and theological discourse is associated with arrogance and condescension. And he raised it with humility. Why? Because he was sensitive to the very folk who believed in various conceptions of God that they were holding on to for dear life. Those 30 years ago, we were wrestling with that question, the Society for the Study of Black Religion. Charles Long, James Cone, Jacqueline Grant, and others. And to have him sitting right here in Newark cannot but so deeply inspire me. And I won't go through the whole list, but I will mention one more, and that's my dear brother. He's a giant, Maulana Karenga, Los Angeles, California. Stand up, my brother. Just give him a hand. Over 40 years of struggle. 40 years of struggle. He's been up, it's been down, it's been round and round. But he's been on fire. Been on fire. Reminds me very much of our beloved poet and activist, Sister Sonia Sanchez. She's always on fire. Always on fire. Amiri Baraka, the same way. I heard it last year. Always on fire. You might agree or disagree, but one thing you cannot deny, that they have a deep love for the people. The great Stokely Carmichael's autobiography being published next month. We're going to have a gathering in Harlem. And every time you saw Brother Stokely or Kwame Ture, he was on fire. In debate, in dialogue. And the philosophy born of struggle, which is the title that Leonard gave it over 20 years ago, of both the text as well as the conference, forces us to wrestle with the question of what does it mean to take philosophy seriously, not simply as a professional discipline, but as a way of life, as a mode of being. Walked in and saw Howard McGarry, Bill Lawson, Lewis Gordon, and my dear friend, young brilliant Brother Eddie Glaude Jr., and Brother Darrell and others. They understand philosophy not as a specialized discourse that allows one to move up into the higher echelons of the professional managerial space of advanced capitalist society, called the academy. Yes, you need a job. You have a livelihood, but no, we're talking about a calling, not just a career. It's a vocation. It's not just a profession. About being successful in order to be great, but greatness defined in what kind of quality your service really is, especially to the disadvantaged. And that's a very serious set of questions. People, Lucius Outlaw and others, he's going to be here tomorrow, is that right? Brother Lucius is going to be here? Vanderbilt tomorrow. Absolutely. We should raise a question. Why even take professional philosophy seriously? Why even take it serious? They begin with the notion of the Enlightenment without wrestling with the night side of that historical moment that Immanuel Kant would say in 1784 in his great essay, What is Enlightenment? The release from self-incurred tutelage, the deliverance from self-imposed immaturity. And yet the same Immanuel Kant would say that he heard a conversation between two persons and it sounded fascinating, but he saw that they were black and therefore he knew what they were saying was stupid. How could such a towering figure, he would shape and mold discourse on epistemology, ethics, and aesthetics, and religion within the limits of reason alone, claiming to be so suspicious of dogmatism and parochialism and provincialism and fundamentalism, be so dogmatic and provincial and parochial and fundamentalist when it came to people of African descent. What's going on here? How could David Hume, the finest philosophic mind in the English language, born in Scotland, a colonial subject vis-a-vis the metropole in London, Write a classic at the age of 27 years old, a treatise of human nature, and then have a nervous breakdown but bounce back. Go on to write other classics, but also write an essay of natural characters and say that he could not conceive of a black person who could go beyond the intelligence of a parrot. Nothing but a vicious dogmatism. We had to proceed lovingly. To take philosophy so seriously that we had to call into question the dogmatism of the exemplary critics of dogmatism. Had to be skeptical of the very critics of skepticism. Why? Because of deliberate ignorance and willful blindness locked into a historical moment in which the humanity of black people, the people of African descent, was rendered invisible. That's what brought us together. And it's true, as Brother Leonard said, we didn't agree on a whole lot, but one thing we did agree on, that we were going to live intellectual lives in such a way that after we were gone, folk would know that we took seriously the suffering of people of African descent, and we're going to produce texts and canons and visions and arguments based on what came before, so that the younger generation would have something to build on. We wouldn't live here in vain. So we proceeded with an acknowledgement that first we had to understand the fact that we were small moments in a great tradition. Goes back to the beginning of humankind. Homo sapiens itself emerging in Africa. How could it be that Homo sapiens emerged as a race, a human race in Africa, and yet by the time we get to the 20th century, people of African descent have their humanity systematically called into question after almost 400 years of slavery and Jim Crow and Jane Crow? We got to tell a story. We've got to understand what happened. How do you get from Timbuktu to the slave auction? Just there with Brother Al Sharpton, stood right there in the dungeon. Saw the room, men separated from the women. And the description of the excrement covering half of their bodies. And then pointed toward the point of no return on their way to the ships. And the 52,400 voyagers from 1444 to 1888. What happened to those grand civilizations of Africa, of Egypt, and Western Africa and others, such that now in the modern period, these people would find their dignity violated, their decency questioned, their humanity always problematized, as Du Bois reminds us, how does it feel to be a problem? A walking flesh and blood, concretized, fleshified problem. Existential. We're not talking about epistemic skepticism. This is existential despair. We're not talking about doubts. We're talking about forms of death. And what I want to suggest tonight is one of the distinctive features of those who philosophize from the vantage point of the doing and suffering of people of African descent, and it is a whosoever will. Be any color, any culture. But if you come from a vanilla suburb, you're going to have to undergo some serious transformation, because you've been socialized and acculturated in such a way that you might think you're taking black humanity seriously, but once it gets concrete and you have an intimate relationship with it, you're going to need some pedagogy, as Plato said, some turning of the soul, some convergent transformation that takes place. But it's possible. It is possible. There are John Browns and Miles Horton and Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel who underwent that transformation. And they emerged with smile and more strength and vision and dignity too. No doubt. But what does it mean to take this tradition seriously? I believe that there's a fascinating short story by William Dempey. William Dempey was a wonderful writer. He wrote a book called Beetle Creek, a novel in 1953. It was published after Invisible Man, so usually American culture can only take one Negro at a time. We know Ralph Waldo Emerson was a great artist, but it's still, he was the HNIC of the literati. He was the head Negro in charge. Even Jimmy Baldwin, all of his genius, couldn't get a foothold for a while because the mainstream culture only take one Negro at a time. But William Dempsey was also a towering figure. He went to Fisk University and he wrote a short story called The Death Grip. He published it in the Fisk University magazine. Then he went off to live in Rome. Never came back. The Catacombs, 1965. Another exile, but not Paris, Rome. But The Death Grip. You read that short story, and you see what? You see the way in which he characterizes the black condition evolving over time, never monolithic, but having a common thread, namely a people who have been on intimate terms with forms of death. Forms of death. And it echoes that line 24a in Plato's Apology that says the unexamined life is not a life for the human, knowing that our English word human derives from the Latin humando, which means burying. Burying. And if in fact human beings are featherless, two-legged, linguistically conscious creatures born between urine and feces who often bury their dead, knowing that they will soon be the culinary delight of terrestrial worms too, then maybe those particular people who are on intimate forms with death have something to say about life. Have something to say about life. Socrates himself says philosophy is what? Meditation on the preparation for death. Montaigne's philosophizes to learn how to die. Seneca says he or she who learns how to die unlearns slavery. There's a connection between wrestling with forms of death and freedom. Didn't say licentiousness. I didn't even say liberty. I said freedom. One of the distinctive features of those who philosophize from the vantage point of the doing and suffering of people of African descent in the modern world. We're not talking about the great African civilizations before, which we can often go to as an understanding of the moments in which African humanity was not called into question. But in the modern world, this intimate relation with death means what? It means you're going to have to cut so radically against the grain, because if you're in the United States, you are in the most death-denying, death-ducking, and death-dodging of all modern civilizations.
Hey, all right.
Which means it's in denial of the night side of the human predicament and the underside of its own civilization and society. There's no accident at all that black folk in sports, in music, and walk, and talk are connected to humando, humility, humanity, earth, what the great George Clinton calls funk. James Brown calls funk, and I know I'm in the city of the greatest voice of the 20th century, Sarah Vaughan. Sarah Vaughan does what? She weaves the highest level of sophistication with the depth of the funk. So it ends up being a gut bucket sophistication. But that's a benchmark of a particular culture of people who make delicacy out of misery. That's a particular feature of a people who have to redefine what it means to be aristocrats coming out of a slaveocracy and call themselves dukes and counts and presidents like Luke Lester Young and others. And I'm not idealizing or romanticizing black folk. No, we're acknowledging their humanity. We have black gangsters? Hell yeah. Black folk run from the funk? Hell yeah. But we're talking about the best of a particular culture that's wrestling with the underside of a hotel civilization. That's what Henry James called American civilization. Why? Because it's a civilization that believes that the lights are always on. It's never any darkness whatsoever. Leave your room as clean, dirty, and come back as clean. You don't know who cleaned it, don't know whether they're being treated with dignity, whether they're unionized, whether they have a fair share. Because it's just about your comfort, just about your convenience, just about your contentment. Oh, that's so quintessentially American at its worst. Of all colors. Why? Because we're the city on the hill. We're the moral exemplar of the world. We have a special relationship with the deity. We can solve all problems. We have no limits. There are no constraints for us because we are Americans. Here to every January in State of the Union. All political parties often use that language as if American babies have more value than a baby in Guatemala or Ethiopia or Iraq or Canada or Tel Aviv or West Bank. Where does that come from? National arrogance. There's somebody laughing in the back. You almost have to laugh to keep from crying sometimes. Talk about that. No doubt about it. But when we look at the history of these people, and this is the context in which we philosophize. Randall Patterson says the threat of social death. No legal status, no social standing, no public value, just commodities to be bought and sold. 244 years. 244 years. Of course, that's against the backdrop of indigenous brothers and sisters whose bodies and backs and land constitutes the very ground upon which the democratic experiment would be promoted. Got Sister Jennifer Vest here, already a brilliant philosopher, young sister, bringing together the black and the red in a fascinating way.
All right.
For what? To keep track of this underside, this night side, not because one is in love with the night, but rather if one wants the light, you can find it in the night. And if you want freedom, you better come to terms with your conditions of unfreedom. And the dominant response of the United States was what? Deny it. Write a constitution and don't even invoke the institution of slavery in your constitution, and yet you're going to end up with a civil war fighting over an institution not invoked in your constitution. That's called denial. Denial. Refer briefly to the slave trade. Okay, but what are they coming for? What are they coming for? 80% of the Supreme Court slaveholders the first 60 years. 75% of your presidents slaveholders. And I'm calling them names. This is not PC chit chat. We're just telling the truth. How long do you think the democratic experiment will last? The chickens will come home. You lose, you know. You're going to lose it. Civil War was about the death of American democracy. Listen to the debate these days in South Carolina. You see the Confederacy flag and they think it's about black folk catching hell and courageous white folk fighting for the Confederacy. That's too narrow, too narrow, too narrow. It's about the death of American democracy because enough American citizens wanted the freedom to keep black folk unfree and were willing to fight for that freedom more than preserve democratic experiments and possibility. That's something much deeper. And we almost lost it over what? The Negro question. Scholars can come up and try to tap dance around it and do hermeneutical maneuvers, X and Y. Well, it may have been about X and Y. And okay, let's get complex. Let's list it. 5 different reasons. Start with slavery. And then tariffs and a whole host of other things. Okay. But that's another form of denial. Deep denial. And then after the Civil War, a moment of an experiment in multiracial democracy. And of course, we had more black senators then than we do now. More Supreme Court justices then than we do now in the 1880s. Then we lost it. Jim Crow, Jane Crow. lynching. Every 2.5 days, some black child, some black woman, some black man hanging from some tree. Strange fruit the southern trees bear that Billie Holiday sang about with such power. Old Brother Maripold, her Jewish friend and comrade, writing the song with her. We don't like to talk about that. And yet the irony is what? The irony is, after 9/11, the whole country feels unsafe, unprotected, subject to random violence, and hated. And yet what was Jim Crow and Jane Crow? But American terrorism. What was Jim Crow and Jane Crow? And slavery. But a context in what? All black folk felt unsafe, unprotected, subject to random violence and hate. It's very important now. So why philosophers who reflect from the vantage point of the doing and suffering of people of African descent have something to say, not just to America, but to the world. Because after 9/11, the whole nation is niggerized. That's what we're dealing with. And white brothers and sisters may run up and ask a black brother, what is it like to be hated? What is it like to be unsafe? What is it like to... Well, sit down and let me tell you something. There's a history here. We got something to say. We got something to say. And if the whole globe is Americanized, then the whole globe will become niggerized. And then the folk who are on intimate terms with the effects of niggerization will have special insight. A blues nation can learn from a blues people. The blues world can learn from a blues people. Look at Emmett Till's mother. What was her response to terrorism? Her baby boy was shot down by American terrorists in a place called Mississippi. Under the Tallahatchie Bridge, she brought his body back, put it on display in Pilgrim's Baptist Church. And Thomas Dorsey playing on the piano. And Reverend Julius Caesar Austin, the dancing preacher, is the pastor. And he puts the body there, she puts the body there. 125,000 fellow citizens of all colors, disproportionately black, look at his body. That was the first modern civil rights demonstration. That's August 1955. That's before the great Rosa Parks sat down in order to stand up for justice.
All right.
When Reverend Austin asked Emmett Till's mother, what do you have to say to the people, the nation, and the world? She stepped up to the pulpit, looked over at her baby whose head was 5 times the size of his ordinary head, and said, I don't have a minute to hate. I'm going to pursue justice for the rest of my life. What level of moral and spiritual maturity is exemplified in looking terrorism in the face and having certainly the human response of wanting to somehow strangle the persons who would engage in such a cowardly and gangsterly act, but also reaching a summit in her own soul where she says, I don't want to be in the gutter of the very folk who have put my son in the gutter. I'm going to break the cycle of violence and bigotry. George Bernard Shaw was right. Hatred is the coward's revenge against those who intimidate one. I'm not going to hate. I'm going to pursue justice in the face of this form of civic death and terrorism, Jim Crow, Jane Crow lynching. My God, if she became the standard for the dominant American responses to niggerization, all of the major responses fall far short. We're going to hunt them down like cockroaches, sweet revenge, short-term revenge. If that had been the dominant response of black people in America, there'd have been a civil war every 6 months. Every 6 months. No social stability, let alone discourse about justice. Why? Because there was a linking of the Socratic imperative to engage in self-examination, self-interrogation, disclosing the tacit assumptions and unarticulated presuppositions of any or argument or vision. But it was connected to a deep sense of love and commitment to compassion. What is also, I think, challenging for philosophers is that it has been both black leaders, black musicians, and black thinkers who have been willing to speak most publicly about the power of love connected to justice. John Coltrane's "A Love Supreme" just doesn't come out of nowhere. Toni Morrison's "Beloved" doesn't come out of nowhere. Her recent novel will be published next week, Love. Marvin Gaye's "What's Going On," the love ethic shot through every note and lyric. And even that genius from Chicago stepping in the name of love. He got issues, we know that, but he's a genius. R. Kelly. But the love I'm talking about has little to do with superficial American conceptions of sentimental love. Because when you've been hated for 400 years, when you've been hunted for 400 years, love has a weight and a gravity. So when Marcus Garvey said, "You must love yourself," that is an emancipatory activity because you've internalized too much hatred. When Elijah Muhammad said, "Islam dignifies," he said, how do you shake that white supremacy in black people that renders them so deeply captive and in bondage that they really believe that they have the wrong hips and lips and noses and hair texture and skin pigmentation. They really believe they're less beautiful and less intelligent and less moral. They really believe that folk who look like them somehow are less. So they can be of infinite value and still call themselves 50 Cent. Still call yourself $1 and $1.50. And he's a talented brother. I love my brother. But each and every person of African descent has a civil war taking place on their soul, on the battlefield of their soul, because they have been bombarded with white supremacist lies about them. As the women been bombarded with male supremacist lies about them, and gay brothers, lesbian sisters, homophobic lies about them. How do you wrestle with that inside of you? None of us ultimately triumph. There's no fundamental escape. The best of the Martins, the Marvin Garveys, the Ella Bakers, and others, they wrestle till the day they die. They wrestle, black philosophers in the academy must wrestle too. And you can hear Ralph Waldo Emerson saying, "Imitation suicide. Emulation's a sign of an adolescent mind." You can hear the Negro National Anthem. You're lifting every voice, but you got to find your voice in order to have something to lift. Didn't lift somebody else's voice. It's like John Coltrane imitating Johnny Hodges. Time to grow up, the great Coltrane. You can't grow up without Monk. You can't grow up without Gillespie. You can't grow up without Miles. They help him grow up. It's a mutual, reciprocal activity. It's a communal activity. That's what's been so wonderful about the black philosophers. We work together.
All right.
Had folks who were Kantians, utilitarians, latitudinarians, Marxists, crypto-Marxists, atheists, agnostic, Islamic, and Christian humanists like myself. And I have yet to thoroughly convince one of my fellow philosophic interlocutors that my Christian humanism is worth holding on to. Which means it keeps me honest.
It's all right.
It keeps me honest. I'm still holding on though. But it keeps me honest. That's what philosophical discourse is all about. If you're wrestling with the do it yourself and people who have African descent, but at the same time knowing you have to deal with a present situation in which what? In which the crisis in one's own civilization is so immense but often overlooked, downplayed, or ignored. That the philosopher of the present moment is to come to terms with the fact that the United States is the uncontested empire in the world. It's a bigger empire than the Roman Empire or the British Empire, the two grand empires of the last centuries or so. Who wants to talk about it? What does it mean to understand yourself as a democracy but be an empire? Oh, there's a little dissonance going on. Sleepwalking taking place. You have a ship in every major ocean in the world. You have troops in over 100 countries. You can go to the UN and manipulate that international institution like it's a puppet. You can threaten other nations with withdrawal of aid. You can invade Afghanistan and Iraq and acknowledge that you're telling lies and no accountability for the most part. It's Thrasymachus in Plato's Republic. Might makes right, raw power, do what you want because you have the resources and the means of communication to promote the mendacity. They won't raise the questions. ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN. You think they're going to raise some fundamental questions about the empire? They've got profits. They can't afford to be critical of America. To be unpatriotic means your ratings go down. You lose your job. You can't engage with what Socrates called parrhesia. In fact, line 24a in Plato's Apology says, parrhesia was the cause of my unpopularity. Parrhesia is frank speech, plain speech, fearless speech. And we're in a moment in which it's very difficult to muster the courage to engage in frank speech, fearless speech. And this is so true for the leaders, including black leaders. It's so true. For the most part, you've got to go to your comics and some of your artists to get some frank speech. Just like we had to go to Richard Pryor to get the real truth about what was going on with white supremacy. Because the leaders wanted to be too proper. They didn't want to talk about the funk too much. Even Brother Martin and all of his greatness, you know, he didn't believe in cracking jokes. Because he knew that the stereotype of black people was buffoon. He didn't want to feed into it. So he was the funniest man in the world, off camera. When the white normative gaze was directed at him, he had to be very serious. Richard Pryor say, forget that. I'm going to let it all hang out. And he was a genius at it. You got to pray for him. The one thing he would never do that so many of these black comics do these days, that he laughed with black people. He never laughed at black people. Big difference. Solidarity. Major difference. But where's the parrhesia these days? Among our philosophers, among the critics, among the politicians. Who really wants to acknowledge the degree to which America has seemingly moved from perceived innocence to corruption without a mediating stage of maturity. And as the great James Baldwin used to say, the innocence itself is the crime before you've done anything. Because if you think you're innocent, then you think no matter what you do, you're part of an axis of good. There's no evil shot through your actions, your history, your present, because you're innocent, you're pristine, you're part of some cheap soap opera-like story, some melodramatic view in which all the good's on your side and all the evil's on somebody else's side. And then here come black folk with a blues sensibility. As Sister Sonia said so beautifully, a tragicomic sensibility. The humor in the tragedy in the comic. The tears and the laughter, that's what the blues is all about. It's sweet and sad indictment of misery. That's the great definition of the blues, the towering figure Lorraine Hansberry. Let us never forget her. Sweet and sad indictment of misery. Socratic because it's critical, but it's also prophetic because it's rooted in tears. But it's not paralyzing at all. It's energizing. Blues mans have been down so long that down don't worry me no more. That's why I keep keeping on. Don't look for the logic. Curtis, they keep on pushing. Where's the evidence, Curtis? I got my guitar. Know you gonna catch hell. Know the police out there. I know you're underemployed. I know you're undereducated. I know they got dilapidated schools. I know the housing is inadequate. You don't have access to health care, unavailable child care, not enough jobs with a living wage. Keep on pushing. Harkening back to the spirituals. Nobody knows the trouble I've seen. Nobody knows but Jesus. Nobody knows the trouble I've seen. Glory, hallelujah. Last line doesn't follow. Doesn't follow. Why? Because it's wrestling with the question, Brother Jones. Brother Jones talked about it. How you going to muster resources in the face of overwhelming evil and yet not allow that evil, that unjustified suffering to have the last word? We're going to find forms of parrhesia. You're going to find forms of fearless speech. It might be just in your music because for over 244 years it would be against the law for you to learn how to read and write. So when you sing a song, your imagination, your intelligence, your subtlety will be manifest on a number of different levels. In the sound, the temper, in the melody, in the harmony. That's why we often went back in our discussion, going back to Tuskegee. How do we come to terms with a genius like Louis Armstrong? Here's a rose through the concrete, definition of Tupac. Might have gave up on red light district, but where did that genius come from? Western blues, my God, it's as tragic as Hamlet and as comic as Falstaff. It's in his horn, responding to the death of his loved one. Humando, he just buried her. Wrestling with who he is. That one loved one he had, his mother. Going back to New Orleans, you see. How do we use that as a resource in terms of coming to terms with these very difficult and challenging questions of the present? The empire. Its maldistribution of wealth. The 1% who own 48% of the net financial wealth. The 5% who own 70% of the net financial wealth. The most vulnerable among all of us, the children, the 21% of children who live in poverty, the richest nation in the history of the world. It's a disgrace. We had a major conference just on children and family. Remember the war against parents? Your wife, why should we talk about children? Remember that letter? Why are you talking about children? That's not a sophisticated subject matter for philosophers. But you know what? You're not our point of reference. We're not our point of reference. We can talk about suffering. Across the board. Children 100% of the future. How are you going to bequeath a tradition to them? See, their motivation structure shattered. Families weak. Communities feeble. Older generation too busy, too narcissistic, too careerist, too individualistic to give them enough love and attention to make them feel as if they really are somebody.
That's right.
And yet the very children who are cast aside, the rejected stone, create the greatest cultural breakthrough in the last 35 years called hip-hop culture. And that music. Same one. Same one. Same one. And let's be honest, it's hard to find a black politician in any town who has told as many truths about the suffering of black people as a Tupac Shakur or Mos Def or Dead Craig or KRS-One or Lauryn Hill. I'm not putting down all politicians or all black politicians, but it includes most of them. Be honest. It includes most. Martin Luther King Jr. said the black freedom movement was a movement of the maladjusted. And what we have created in the last 30 years is a class of well-adjusted Negroes to the status quo. And the challenge is, how do you create maladjusted folk to the injustice in the status quo? Because if you maladjusted to injustice, then you're on fire like the folk I introduced. But it's so easy to become well-adjusted. It's easy to become well-adjusted in the universities. These are bastions of privilege and luxury. And you think that somehow you're really getting by. Which means that you're acting in such a way that you render those in power comfortable enough to make you think you're being accepted long enough for you to become adjusted. Every 30, 40 years or so, it takes a host of different voices to exercise parties. Usually it comes from places we know not of. Often it comes from the prison, and this vicious prison industrial complex that makes money off the cheap labor of incarcerated folks with its market-driven character, and which is of economic interest to make sure you have more criminals in order to make a profit on it, given its status on Wall Street, and a criminal justice system that differentially channels young black youth and brown youth and poor white brothers and sisters into the prison industrial complex. And who talks about it? What politician do you know talks about it openly? Brother Sharp is the only one. Brother Kucinich every once in a while. Mainstream Democrats won't touch it with a 10-foot pole. Republicans talk about it all the time. Lock more of them up. Lock more of them up. Mandatory sentence. That's the problem. That's why the crime has gone down. Giuliani's a hero. They have a right to do that. Everybody has a right to make a fool of themselves in a democratic society. We argue with them back and forth, but they're winning the argument in terms of power, and the result is we're losing a whole slice of a younger generation in a prison industrial complex. Thank God for Angela Davis raising this issue with such power and tenacity. When will it overflow? More and more philosophers writing about it now. What does that say about us? Let's be not just the gadflies. Let's try to be fallible truth tellers and imperfect witness bearers. But most importantly, let us boldly expose the lies. We just lost a towering figure in Edward Said. Towering figure. American original, Arab original, Palestinian original. He was always part of our discussion as black philosophers. Or philosophers concerned with doing something with black folk. But what was distinctive about him is what? He always had the courage to think for himself. He talked about autocratic Arab states, those elites using Palestinians like football, political football, to hide and conceal their own authoritarian structures. The Arab world criticized him vehemently. You didn't hear it in the States because the States media is so truncated. Then he come back to the States and he gets criticized here for being anti-Semitic because he wants to tell the truth about the underside of the state of Israel. He says, look, I'm just a truth teller. I cry when an Israeli baby dies in Tel Aviv. I cry when a Palestinian baby dies on the West Bank. I am a humanist. And I'm going to keep track of both sides. And I'm going to tell the truth about both sides. If I see the limitations of Arafat and I see the limitations of Sharon, if one is known to much of the world as a war criminal for what he did in killing innocents, and the other is known as barbaric because he tends to turn his face when suicide bombers are killed in Tel Aviv, I'll tell both sides of it. That's a great tradition. And he learns in part in the U.S. context from the Frederick Douglasses and the Ella Bakers and the Martin Kings and Stokely Carmichaels and others. That's precisely this philosophy born of struggle. That's what it's all about. Sisters came in, I think Anita Allen is here. Is she going to be here?
She has bronchitis.
Oh, God bless her. Okay, because she's also somebody who's been part of this discussion from the very beginning. And you can't talk about this without talking about patriarchy. You can't talk about this without talking about escalating domestic violence. The cowardly black brothers don't want to confront the boss and come home and beat their wives and girlfriends. Scars, bruises, going hand in hand. Imperial consolidation goes hand in hand with machismo consolidation. Because the army's got to be tough and phallocentric to protect the motherland, which is soft. And the man feels he's got to be hard and pose and posture, but only against the soft. Walmart. The vicious forms of patriarchy that shot through America as a whole, the globe as a whole, but especially here. And we must not forget its role in the black community, because the role of black women has been not just indispensable, it has been fundamental, but often minimized. And in a moment in which so many young black men believe the white supremacist stereotype of black men, which is hyper-criminal and hypersexual, and think that to go through life is to go through life hard, posing and posturing like some outlaw cowboy, and not know they're mirroring the worst of American civilization with its Jesse James and Daniel Boone's, and think that they on the cutting edge. You say, you're not keeping it real. Young folk walking around with Nike like they're walking commercials for American corporations and say they're keeping it real. Come on, let's get serious. Let's get serious. You've got a history, don't you know that? You see young black folk walking around with books, reading Du Bois, reading Kafka, reading Tennessee Williams, all of them blues folk, all of them got tragic comic sensibilities. And other black folk telling them, oh, you're acting white, you must really think you somebody. Where you get that from? It doesn't fall from the sky. It's white supremacist stereotypes that bombard them day in and day out. To be black is to be hyper-criminal and hypersexual. Get your thing on. With the bling bling. The materialism, the backdrop for the hedonism. And of course, they are doing nothing but imitating older folks. They're looking at older folk and see their cars, their houses, their priorities. They don't see that much sacrifice for the freedom. They don't see so much parrhesia exercised. We got debates over gangster rap 10 years ago as if somehow young black folk have a monopoly on gangster sensibilities and articulating that sensibility. No, when they look at the White House, they see elections stolen. They look at Wall Street, they see Enron and WorldCom. They see gangsters at work. And they simply think about what they see in more raw form. They see churches. 2 ATMs before you see the cross. Oh, another business enterprise, huh? Got a mega church, big market, don't you? Call yourself CEO now, no longer reverend or minister. Interesting. You got to hustle, I got to hustle, everybody got to hustle. I know I'm going on and I'm going to bring it to a close. We see one dialogue as well, but getting a little carried away because the memories of the dialogues that we had. And now that it's becoming more public, there's a sense in which we not only struggled in vain, but even while we're still alive, we can see some of the fruits. We've always believed philosophy is not about producing foliage. It's about bearing fruit. It's not something just to look at so everybody can see how clever and smart you are, including your colleagues, so you can move up the ladder. It's about bearing fruit. And the fruit that you bear has to do in the lives and souls and hearts and minds of your fellow citizens, your fellow human beings, and especially the younger generation. To build on the tradition that you have had the privilege to inhabit just for a moment. So then you can turn to Marcus, you can turn to Ella, you can turn to Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel and say, we tried to keep alive what you bequeathed to us. We know we failed because we didn't do all that we wanted to do, but we did enough to pass it on to the next generation so that at least the truth, the bearing witness of justice and love, and the attempt to expose the lies will not be completely eclipsed by a despair and a night-like condition in this nation, in our various communities, and around the world. Because what happens here now, global implication, no doubt about it. In Africa, various struggles in Latin America, complex situations in Asia, all tied together, all interdependent. So when C.L.R. James raised the question, why is it that so many of the intellectuals are so obsessed with the French Revolution, given all of its grand and immense consequences, and say nothing about those same French revolutionaries who would impose authoritarian structures on Haiti? Can we keep our eyes on both at the same time? The breakthrough against the ecclesiastical authorities in France. But when it comes to white supremacist authority, the very revolutionaries become reactionaries. And how do we ensure that we don't fall into that kind of cycle? What a challenge. There's always a challenge, but there's joy in the challenge. And I want to end on this note. I want to end on the blue note, because the blue's neither optimistic nor pessimistic, but it is about joy. And if we can't convince young folk that there's real joy in philosophic argument, there's real joy in political struggle, there's real joy in intellectual wrestling with these kind of questions. The problem of evil might in fact turn you around and upside down, but there's still a joy in the process, even though many of us believe there's no resolution. Or maybe the only response is like the conclusion of an Aristotelian practical syllogism, which is action, praxis, fighting against the grain. It's hard to say. I think in some ways that's why black folk created swing. The way Muhammad Ali swings, the way Ella Fitzgerald swings, the way Lester Young swings. And that swinging is what? There's no theoretical resolution to all of this pain and grief, but we're going to be swinging until we go down and allow that next generation to keep swinging too, intellectually, politically, economically, and existentially. And the important thing is for us just to keep on swinging. Thank you all so very much.